Sale of animals. The following are the important rules in case of sale of animals. A sale of animals suffering from contagious disease is void. If the use of service for which the animal has been acquired had been stated in the contract and they are found to be unfit, therefore the sale is void. If the animal should die within 3 days after the purchase, a seller shall be liable if the disease which caused the death already existed at the time of the contract. If 2 or more animals are sold together for lump sum or for a separate price for each of them, the hidden defect of one will not give rise to the cancellation of the sale of others, unless it can be proved that the buyer would not have purchased the sound animal or animals without a defective one. The invisibility of the sale shall be presumed when a team, pair, or set is brought, even if a separate price has been fixed for each one of the animals composing the same, and there is no warranty against hidden defects of animals sold at fairs or at public auction or livestock sold as condemned. Double or multiple sales. In case of double or multiple sales, the rules and the preference of ownership depend on whether the property is sold is a real or personal property. Real property. If a real property has been sold to 2 or more buyers, the rules and preference of ownership shall be the buyer who first registers in good faith the sale in the registry of deeds. Second, in the absence of registration, the buyer who first possessed in good faith the property purchased. And third, in the absence of registration and possession, the buyer who has the oldest title in good faith, or he who bought the property in good faith. The rules and preference of ownership in case of personal property has been sold or 2 or more buyers shall be: the buyer who first possesses the property purchased in good faith, and in the absence of possession, the buyer who has the oldest title in good faith, or he who first bought it in good faith. Conventional redemption. It is a process whereby seller, by virtue of a stipulation in a contract of sale, is allowed to get back or redeem property sold within the property period of time fixed in a contract or declared by law, provided he returns the price and some other things at the time of repurchase. This kind of sale is also called the sale with right to repurchase or pacto de retro sale. The period to redeem will depend on the agreement or on the date stated in the contract, but in no case shall it exceed 10 years from the date of the sale. Take note that the agreement in a repurchase of the things sold as soon as the seller has the money to redeem it is with the period indefinite, and therefore the redemption period is within 10 years from the date of the contract. If there is a prohibitive period of redemption, the period to redeem will begin after the prohibitive period, but always within 10 years from the date of the sale. If the sale is with the right to repurchase, but there is no period agreed upon within which to redeem, the period of redemption is within 4 years from the date of the contract. What will be the return by the seller to the buyer in the case of redemption pacto de retro sale? Price of the sale, expenses of the contract, other legitimate expenses made by reason of the sale, necessary and useful expenses made on the thing sold. Legal redemption. It is a process whereby the law automatically grants to certain persons the right to get back the property sold upon reimbursements of the price for reasons of public policy. The person entitled to this right are the following: the co-owner of the property involved. The co-owner of a property has the right to legally redeem all the shares of the co-owners or any of them, which are sold to third parties. This right may be exercised by the co-owner within 30 days from written notice by seller by reimbursing to the buyer the amount paid by him. If the share or shares are sold for grossly excessive amount, the co-owner who desires to exercise this right shall pay only a reasonable amount. If 2 or more co-owners decide to exercise this right, they may only do so in proportion to their respective shares in a thing owned in common. This right of co-owner shall not be available if co-owner sold this share to another co-owner. The adjacent owner of the property involved. Adjacent owner of rural land. The adjacent owner of rural land, the area of which does not exceed 1 hectare, is legally entitled to exercise the right of legal redemption unless the buyer grantee does not own any rural land. If 2 or more adjacent owners desire to exercise the right, the one the one who owns a lesser area shall be preferred. If the area of land owned by the adjacent owners are the same, he who first requested the redemption shall be preferred. Between a co-owner and an adjacent owner, the co-owner has a preferential right to exercise legal redemption. The period of the adjacent owner to exercise his right is the same as the period given to a co-owner, i.e., within 30 days from written notice by the seller. The reason for a grant of this right is to foster the development of agricultural land. Adjacent owner of urban land. When an urban land, which is so small cannot be used for practical purposes and purchased only for speculation, is to be resold, the adjoining owner has the right of preemption at a reasonable price. The purpose for the grant of this right is to adjoining the owner is to prevent speculation. If two or more adjoining owners desire to exercise the right, he whose intended use of the property has been justified shall be preferred. If it has already been sold, the adjoining owner can exercise the right of legal redemption within the same period as co-owner. The real estate owner whose property has been sold for tax delinquency. A landowner whose property has been sold for a payment delinquent tax thereon has a period of 1 year from the registration of the sale within which to legally redeem it. Sale of property on installment basis. Recto law. Recto law. This law applies to contract of sale of personal property, the price which is payable in installment. Under this law, the seller remedies in case of buyer's failure to pay one or more installments are: demand for specific performance, payment of unpaid installment, if the buyer fails to pay one or more installments. The second remedy is rescind the contract of sale if the buyer fails to pay two or more installments. In the case of property sold is mortgage to the seller to secure the payment of the balance, the seller may avail of the above two remedies before he foreclosed the mortgage. Once the seller immediately foreclosed the mortgage property for failure of the buyer to pay two or more installation, he has no right to demand for deficiency in case of proceeds of sale. After foreclosure is less than the amount of obligation, any stipulation making the buyer liable for the deficiency after the foreclosure sale is void. Maceda law. This law applies to the contracts of sale of a movable property on installments. As the title of the law suggests, it gives emphasis to the rights of the buyer, to wit, Realty Buyer Protection Act. If the buyer has paid installment for at least 2 years, he is entitled to a mandatory grace period to pay the unpaid installment without interest, equivalent to 1 month for every year of installments payment made. If the contract is cancelled or rescinded, the vendor shall refund for the buyer in cash the cash surrender value equivalent to 50% of the total payment made. After 5 years of installment, the buyer is entitled to additional 5% every year, but not exceeded 90% of the total payment made. If the installment paid were less than 2 years, the vendor shall give the buyer a grace period of not less than 60 days. If the buyer fails to pay the installment due to expiration of the grace period, the seller may cancel or rescind the contract after 30 days from receipt by the buyer of the notice of cancellation or demand for rescission by notarial act. Excuse me. The notice of cancellation or demand for rescission should be notarized. Otherwise, the buyer can still offer to pay the unpaid installment beyond the grace period. PD number 9957, the Subdivision and Condominium Buyers Protective Degree. Excuse me. Under the said decree, installments payment made by the buyer in a subdivision or condominium project for the lot or unit he contracted to buy shall not be forfeited in favor of the owner or developer when the buyer, after due notice to owner of developer, desists for further payment due to the failure of the owner or developer to develop the subdivision or condominium project according to the approved plans and within the time limit of complying with the same. Such buyer may, at his option, be reimbursed the total amount paid including amortization interest. The rights of the buyer in case of failure to pay installments due to reasons other than mentioned above shall be governed by the Maceda law.